Hey, everybody. Welcome to Bold Calling. This is our monthly webinar series. This month we have Yes and Selling, building a dynamic omnichannel sequence. We're happy you're here. Couple of housekeeping things like I mentioned. We love questions. So at any point, if you have questions for our two experts here, you can go ahead and use that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Submit your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. This is being recorded. I will be sending it out. Anybody who registered will get it by end of day tomorrow. And then I want to invite you to join us next month, September 19th, for our next installment of Bold Calling, which is Selling with Data Science, which should be fun. And let me just copy paste that link for y'all in the chat right now. And then also in the chat, we'd love to see where you are in the world. So just let us know. Great. So just a couple of introductions. Today we have, I missed Will. Went too fast. There we go. Will is here from Lavender. He's a sales rep, creator, trainer in the B2B space. Lots of experience, some amazing Star Wars memorabilia behind him that we were talking about earlier. And we're really happy you're here to share your expertise. And then from the Orum side, we have Allie. Who has had so many different roles in the sales space, but is now leading your own team, Allie, I believe. Is that correct? Yes, awesome.
Yes.
So, congrats on that, and excited to chat with both of you guys and pick your brains. So let me stop sharing here. And so the first question I have, so omnichannel, like why? What are the benefits of mixing up the channels? What are the channels that you're thinking about when you're talking about omnichannel? I'll throw it to you, Will. So why are we even doing this? Why is this even a good idea?
Yeah, I often think about when we're reaching out to people, I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make is not following up. So the idea of sequences is just doing that in lots of different ways, because realistically, people we're reaching out to are quite busy, and they're also kind of particular as well. And everyone has a different way that they prefer to be contacted, right? So by following up multiple times on multiple different chances, we give ourselves the best chance of reaching our buyers where they want to be reached, where they're going to listen to us. Because if you don't do that, you send one email, you make one cold call, chances are they're not going to pick up. Chances are they might not listen to that voicemail. Chances are they aren't going to read the email. But if you do that several times over a period of time, you're going to get noticed. And in that case, ideally, you're going to get a response, either book a meeting or find out they're not a fit. So that's the whole idea of omnichannel and sequences in general.
Got it. And then Allie, any thoughts from you of like, why do we even do this?
Yes. Yeah. I am in total alignment with Will. Finding and meeting the prospect where they're at, right? So we don't know how they like to engage. Some people love phone calls. Some people hate them. Some people like LinkedIn. Some people don't. So I'm a big believer in, understanding how prospects like to engage, and we have to try all channels. I think the other aspect of why omnichannel is so important is because you can have your channels all working together. So what I mean by this is, let's say you're using a mix of email, social, video, cold calls, voicemails. Have them all drive to next touch points. One of the ways that we do this is by having voicemails drop. So as we're calling, we'll have voicemails drop that reference, hey, I sent you this email the other day, including X, Y, and Z. And having your voicemail reference that email can increase the chances of getting a response via email. Or same thing with LinkedIn. Hey, Allie with Orum, I connected with you on LinkedIn. Don't worry about calling me back. We can just chat on LinkedIn too, right? And sort of that pattern disrupt as well is a very helpful way to understand how your buyers want to engage, and getting responses through different channels too.
Got it. And then can you both talk about, to give people a sense of like, what does success look like? What does a good sequence look like, or where have you seen success yourself? Allie, let's start with you. I know you mentioned pilots. I don't know what that is.
Yes. So here at Orum, we actually run free pilots. So all of our potential customers will go through a pilot with Orum. And one of the ways that we help set them up for success is by recommending some structure of the sequence. So one of the things that I highly recommend is having your sequence start with day one, a manual custom email. The reason why that's very helpful is, one, you can take that time and diligence, and as you're prospecting and looking at the account, all that research that you're doing, put it into that email. And then you have that email to reference for all other channels that you're working. So we're big fans of structuring the sequence just with that manual email on day one. And then I like to have a lot of calls in my sequence. And so having like a call on day 2 and referencing that what you mentioned in that first email, any specific information around, if they're hiring or different research that you've done, is very helpful to reference in that second call. And then trickling in some LinkedIn messages and then some auto email bumps as well. Case studies are always a good way or a good thing to put in your messaging too, of just how other customers are using your solution or examples of teams using your solution. But as a best practice, I'm a big fan of putting a custom manual email at the very start of the sequence to set the tone and show the prospect you've done your due diligence.
Awesome. And then, so same question, Will, I know, can you talk about like, what would you look as an ideal sequence? Like, how long is it? What the number of steps are?
Yeah. I think it's kind of funny in a way because, Lavender is an email tool, Orum is very well known as a calling tool. I actually started with a cold call, but for different reasons. And I don't think there's any really one right way to do this. And I'm sure we'll get onto this a little bit later, a lot of it's testing, finding out what works for you. So for me, when I think about sequences, I used to have a trainer who had like a 50-step sequence, and I think that's a bit much. And it'd go on for like a month or two. And by the end of that, you're getting people come back to you like, leave me alone. But funny enough, a lot of the replies happened after step 15. So like there is money being left on the table if you don't make them a certain length, but I think they could overkill as well. So for me, I'm thinking like, I want to treat it almost like a sprint where I'll come in, be there for 2 weeks, very present, a lot of channels, a lot of messaging, a lot of switching up as well. And then I might hold off for a little bit longer, maybe target someone else at the account and then wait a few months and then maybe retarget that person with new messaging or new problems or new observations, whatever maybe I'm reaching out to them because of. But for me, my first step, I'm going to do a little cheeky cold call. And the reason I do that is just because I think if I get someone on the phone without doing all the rest of the steps, I'm going to save myself a buttload of time if I can figure out if they're a fit or not very quickly. And on that cold call, in a really similar way to how Allie mentioned, getting the email and then referencing the call. Sending the email and then referencing the email in your call. I'll actually reference in the voicemail, which are often there's tools that can help you leave voicemails automatically, or I'm being one of them. I'll reference, hey, I'm about to shoot you an email. Keep an eye out for it. It's going to be coming from will.aitken@lavender.ai. And then I'll send an email saying, hey, just gave you a buzz. Don't worry about returning my call. This is the reason I was reaching out. And then I'll give them, some of the problems that I think they might be facing based on what I've observed about them before I put them in the sequence. So that's how I'd start, but we can go on to some later steps as well.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, how do you end it?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a divisive question, Laura, because most people went with a breakup email, but a lot of prospects really hate breakup emails because I see a lot of sales reps make the mistake of like these kind of like, I don't know a better word for it, but chuggy. That's a Gen Z term I recently learned and I can't stop saying it. Cringy, I would say. Like these breakup emails, they're like, hey, you haven't got back to me. And it kind of like guilts the person into like, you've ignored me for 2 weeks. How dare you? I think that's a really bad way to do it because you can leave like a sour taste in the person's mouth. It's not their fault they didn't reply to the cold messaging that you sent them. Half the time they didn't ask for it, right? So instead, I like to finish with like a breakup email, but a little bit of a different twist on it by saying, hey, been reaching out because I saw this about you. I thought that might mean that you might be facing problem A, B, C. Seems my time might be off. I'll leave you to it for now. Let me know if I'm wrong though. And that's a great way to leave off, but also keep the door open for future. Because the last thing you want to do is like, I'm gonna leave you alone. We're done. We're breaking up. And then you come back 2 months later and like, it's me again. It's kind of like the toxic ex who just won't go away. So that's how I'd finish off. Allie, I'd love to hear your final step though.
Yeah, I agree as well. Like you want it to be a positive experience. You're reaching out cold, right? Initially, or in a lot of situations to prospects. One that I've leveraged in the past, very similar to you, is kind of putting the ball in their court of like, hey, I've been reaching out, I've sent calls or I've made calls, I've sent emails. And one of the things I've had success with to get a response at least is a poll. I'm either like off base here and we're totally misaligned on the pain or it doesn't resonate. Second option, this is interesting, but the timing isn't right. Or third option, an opt-out, right? I think is always fine to give as well. Fourth option, like I'm not the right person, talk to somebody else. I've had success with kind of that pattern disrupt as well, of giving them sort of that poll option and getting a response there too.
Gotcha. Cool. So next question. Since you both have been doing this a while, you're both experts. What are like the common mistakes that you see maybe newer salespeople make, or just something that you see happen a lot? Allie, let's start with you.
Yeah, first and foremost, double check your grammar and your spelling. Seems like a simple one, but you'd be surprised. Second, and this also seems like a simple one, but make sure you're checking your brackets. If you're using a solution like Outreach or SalesLoft or Apollo, Lavender, like make sure you have these items and that those brackets are being filled out so that, you're not sending like, hi, first name. So very common, everyone's made that mistake at some point in their career, I feel like. So always a good one to just go back to basics and double check. The other thing I would say of what, things to avoid or what not to do is don't pivot too quickly. So what I mean by this is there's a lot of power in A/B testing and testing out different messaging or different structures for sequences and putting, enough practice into those those sequences and messaging to confidently say, yes, this works, or no, this doesn't work. I frequently see teams sort of pivoting too quickly. Maybe they send like 50 emails in one and they haven't gotten, the responses that they were looking for, and they totally scrap it. So Outreach has some really great benchmarks for sort of A/B testing and the volume of things that you should put in. But I'd say at least around 200 deliveries on emails to see like if that's, messaging is working and effective, and always have them A/B test with that one and with that other option to see which one's performing better as well. So don't pivot too quickly. Give it the time that it needs to test things out.
Got it. And then, yeah, Will, same question. What mistakes do you notice people making?
I love that pivoting too quickly, doing 50 emails. Oh, this doesn't work. I see that happen a lot of like different channels. Like people write off cold call and they're like, oh, I made 5 cold calls. No one picked up. No one picks up the phone anymore. You've got to get like a good sample out there. Who knows if you make 50 calls or send 50 emails, could be the 51, 52, 53, 54, and 55 that will come back and book a meeting, right? So, and also sales skills come from repetition. I think one of the biggest mistakes I see actually is sometimes I find like a lot of junior sellers get given these tools. You mentioned a few there, Outreach, Apollo, SalesLoft, and then they're kind of just left to go and like do whatever they need to do with it. And they over depend on automation, which it isn't the worst in the world because you can get a lot done with that and it allows you to feel, but it ends up that you're not really learning how to do it when you're over depending on automation. So like, as I said, with cold calling, repetition is going to make you better at cold calling. You make lots of calls, you're going to get more comfortable, less nervous, better tone, learn how to answer questions better. The same thing can happen with email, but not if you're just automating everything you send out. You're not going to learn how to write better emails. You're not going to learn how to develop those skills. But also there are some really dire consequences that can happen from that. Because if you blast 200 emails out, you watch, like, I feel like every seller I've spoken to has had this experience. They get locked out of Gmail and they have to contact their admin and go, hey, can you let me back in? I sent too many emails. That's one, annoying because you're locked out and your admin's going to, not this again, the SDR. But two, that can have really bad effects on your company's deliverability, because sending lots of emails, especially in a short period of time, can flag your domain reputation and your email address in particular and make it really hard for your emails to get delivered to the primary inbox in the future, which means all your emails are going to go to spam. And that means no one's going to see them because no one really looks at the emails in that spam folder unless they're hitting the delete button. So I'd be really careful of abusing some of these tools. And if you are going to use them for automation, I'd just make sure like the simplest thing you can do to make sure that doesn't happen is just spacing out your sends. There are settings you can do in Outreach, SalesLoft, and Apollo that say, okay, if I'm going to automate step 1 as an email and it's going to be automated, you can set it so each send to each individual prospect will be more than 5 minutes apart. And just doing that will often prevent you from being flagged by these email clients and shoved in the spam folder, which is definitely not where we want to be.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Everyone's gone through, I feel like at some point, like, hey, could you let me back in? Which again goes back to, the topic of today is omnichannel, right? So not just having those auto emails be triggered and sent, and that's it, but having calls, having, LinkedIn, having videos, having manual emails. Those are other ways to make sure your deliverability is high.
And then Allie, a question for you. When we were prepping for this, you were talking about team-based sequences rather than just like individual rep sequences. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that's important?
Yeah, of course. So different opinions on this. And that's what I love about the SDR space and selling in general is there's no like right or wrong way. There's just different tactics to leverage and test. I am a big fan of team-based sequences. And what I mean by that is not having reps operate, especially in the sales development space, in silos. So instead of cloning, let's say you have one sequence, and instead of each of your reps cloning that sequence and kind of putting their own little spin on it, or changing a couple little pieces, or editing the email template or the structure, I'm a big fan of having everyone use the same sequence, at least until we get some consistency with it around that 200 prospects through mark, to understand if it's performing or if it's not. What I've seen in the past is sometimes when teams that I've led have gone rogue and everyone is using different messaging, or everyone is using different sequences, it takes a lot more prospects from that one person put into that sequence to test and know how it's performing. And I can see that, hindering people's performance. And it's also hard to scale. So versus if we have 10 reps all putting 10 prospects into a sequence, we're going to know a lot faster with lower risk for each of the reps if it's performing or if it's not. So I'm a big fan of team-based sequences, and then also setting up sequence committees. So we want to have creativity, and I think it's really important to power reps to test different messaging as well. But putting it into a sequence committee can be a helpful way of sort of streamlining it so it doesn't feel as chaotic or rogue and everyone's using different messaging. So what that means to me is having a couple of different reps own creating new messaging and testing it, rolling that out to the team, and advocating that everybody puts at least a handful of prospects in there. And then based on how it's performing, we can say, yep, we're using this one for the future, or nope, we don't want to use this one in the future. It didn't perform as well as the last one. So that's my thought process on like the team-based sequences, but there's lots of different options and different strokes for different folks here.
So, well, I know when we were prepping, you mentioned, just pushing back on that idea a little bit, you're like, yeah, you don't necessarily want people to go rogue, but.
Well, that's probably a symptom of me, how I was to manage. Going rogue was my middle name, which probably made me a nightmare for any sales leader. I've never been a sales leader as well, because frankly, there'd be HR violations being thrown out all over the shop, right? No, I'm just kidding. But the point is, I think, like, yes, definitely that's a good way to go about it, especially when you're dealing with a lot of folks who may be newer to the team. I really liked, Allie, what you said about like people earning the right to kind of then go ahead and experiment later. Because otherwise you can run into some of those problems that I mentioned earlier, right? If a rep goes ahead and sets up like 50 automated steps, then they could really do a lot of damage to the company, both the brand and that domain reputation we were speaking about before. The reason I may have in the prep call is because we were using a sequence at one of my old companies, and I did go rogue. And we actually found out that, like, looking at it, the sequence looked like it was performing best, but then we went into it and we're actually getting a lot of negative responses, which I see a lot of people like, oh, our reply rate's great on this sequence. We weren't realizing that a lot of those replies were unsubscribed, not interested, please stop emailing me, take me off your list, or like angry prospects on the phone, or like, where the hell did you get my number? So then when we actually dived into it, I was running a separate sequence by myself, and we found out that one was actually performing, which then became the main sequence, which I think is experimentation. I didn't have permission to go ahead and do that. I just kind of did it. I think there's space for experimentation, but I think Allie's right. At the time I was an AE, I wasn't, it wasn't my first rodeo. So I think that could probably be done in a more controlled manner that is less risky to the brand. So we agree.
Awesome.
I love it. Earning the right.
That's great. So kind of moving forward, so we have some examples of like what good sequences look like. So then let's talk about like timing and time batching. So once like someone's in a sequence, like how do you time batch and how do you avoid having prospects get stuck? Allie, let's start with you.
Yeah, this is a very common question. I think there are lots of different ways that you can go about this, but I'm a big believer in that time batching methodology. And what I mean by that is focusing just on one type of task. So as you're going into, or however you manage your sequences, Outreach, Apollo, Sales Loft, there's tons of different solutions out there. But I like to tackle specific types first and then go to the next. So for example, depending on your productivity and when your brain is firing on emails or how you like to make cold calls, some people like to get their cold calls done in the morning. So if that's you, block that time, and in that time you're just smashing out your dials. Then you go in and just send your custom manual emails, and you're just focused on writing really killer custom emails. Then you go in and you're just focused on LinkedIn tasks and connecting or sending or liking things on LinkedIn. And then last, if you're leveraging video, then you're sending and creating these videos. So you can kind of bucket your time into ways that makes most sense for you in terms of your productivity, but also like that one track mind. When you're writing emails, you're just focused on writing emails. I see a lot of very new SDRs sometimes jump in and pull up their tasks and just start going through all the steps of a sequence, which can get really discombobulating, where they're calling and then they're sending an email, and it's just very difficult to kind of streamline the flow and rhythm. Whereas, especially in the cold calling space, if you're just focused on calling and you start getting into those conversations, then the flow starts to happen and the synergy starts to happen, and you start getting that rhythm in your talk tracks, and more meetings are booked that way. And same thing with emails, LinkedIn, all the other channels.
Got it. And would you say this is true for like, would you call like by persona or call by like industry too? Would you batch it that way as well?
Yeah, there's so many ways you can filter down. I'm a big fan of, yes, especially when you're calling, filtering down based on talk track. So based on your ICP, maybe your talk track is around industry. Maybe your talk track is around persona. Maybe your talk track is just level. So when you're calling C-levels, regardless of persona, it's the same, a similar talk track for C-level than it is for a manager level. So whatever makes most sense for you and your organization, batching that way too. So for me, when I like to call, I'll filter by one, priority. So I'll filter like if it's a high priority task, low priority, and then I'll also filter by title. That will help me sort of streamline. When I'm talking Orum, we sell to sales leaders, SDR leaders. When I'm talking to a sales VP, it's a very different conversation than if I'm talking to, a CRO or a SDR team lead, right? There's different things that'll create those sizzle moments in your conversation. So I'm a big fan of batching by persona or title.
Gotcha. And Will, how do you approach it?
Yeah. So to touch on the first point, time management, huge. When you're doing your sequences, thinking about when the steps are going to line up with when you're actually going to do them. What you said, Allie, just about blocking your time effectively will mean that you get in a really good rhythm. Humans are really good at it's like when you're dancing, you get better the longer you dance. You kind of get the beat all of a sudden. I don't, because I can't dance, but I'm sure other people do. But the more you do something, again, it's that repetition. You're going to be better at your 30th cold call is going to be better than your first. You're going to be going from cold call to email to this, and you're going to get distracted. So I really recommend setting some really firm blocks in your calendar to get these tasks done, and timing your sequences as well of when they start to match up with when data says, it's going to be best. So some research we did recently, I'll just share it really quickly because it was actually really interesting. It just came out. I was like, oh, this is juicy. But some research we did recently was what weekday has the highest reply rate based on when the email was sent. So with this in mind, if our first step is an email, we might want to start the sequence on a Wednesday when the reply rate we know on average across the entire industry, across our data set is highest, right? But that also now allows me to say, okay, I know on Thursday morning, I am wired, I am pumped, and that is the best time for me making cold calls. So you can time your steps based on how you're going to be most effective, and then you can block the time to make sure those tasks get done. Because a cold call, a LinkedIn request, liking someone's post on LinkedIn is going to be a manual step, and I find those do clog up if you don't get them knocked out. So you got to make sure you have time managed accordingly. To your actual question, which I just went on to something completely different. I like to batch my sequences based on trigger rather than persona, or maybe a combination of both. So a trigger would be something happened that made me think that person might be more in need of what I'm selling. So we sell to sales leaders, but to switch up the example, for example, if I was selling to small law firms and I was selling them marketing and advertising services, well, I might batch each of the law firms that have launched in the last year in a certain area into one sequence. And that means I can call 20 different lawyers or law firm owners and use the same talk track in my opener and say, hey, saw that you recently launched in the Toronto area. We've been working with this client. I can use the same case study because they found that it was a noisy space and they weren't getting any attention. No one's finding them. How are you advertising today? That might be a talk track I could use for all 20 of those. Because again, I want to be in that rhythm of using the same opener every time, but also remaining relevant to them. So it's not coming across as something generic on every single call as well. And with the emails as well. So I'm a big fan of trigger-based sequences. So I'll have a trigger for, their team's growing, or they're using outreach, or they're using sales loft here at Lavender. Those are some of the triggers I might use. Or maybe even their employees are liking a bunch of our LinkedIn content, because then I can call them and be like, hey, seen a bunch of your team are engaging with our content. We post a lot of email tips. Tells me they might be lacking confidence when it comes to emails. How are you currently coaching your team on that? And that opens up a really good conversation and sounds like I'm informed, even though I can use the opener with like 50 different leaders, you know? And that just reduced the amount of thought and potential error for me in my cold call opener, when I'm personalizing my emails, when I'm sending LinkedIn messages. Everyone's not going to be the same, but they're going to be similar.
Got it. And then, Allie, one of the things we were talking about in prep was batching by goals. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So especially with cold calling, I find that the call to action is not always the same based on who you're calling. I just, as a side note, Will, I love what you're doing on the triggers and using that to kind of tailor your talk track, or understand like where they might be struggling or where there might be pain. I think it's a similar thing when you're calling different types of personas. So for example, let's say I'm calling, sometimes I'll call, SDRs. Like, hey, curious, on the Orum side, like getting more understanding of how long it takes for them to make cold calls, or how many connections, or what their experience is cold calling. The goal of that conversation is information gathering. It's not to book a meeting, it's just to get more context. So then once I have that conversation, I can use that information and call the CRO. And then I'm going to have a lot better of a conversation because I have some insider knowledge, insider information of what people might be struggling with, and can sort of paint a picture of how we can help solve a big picture metric for that CRO based on what I've found. I think same thing. Sometimes when you're calling C-level, ideally we can get a meeting, but if you don't, that's okay. You can then use that conversation and use that for managers or directors, since oftentimes they're closely connected to the pain as well, and sort of just creating this multi-threading in your cold calls and in your messaging, and recognizing that the goal of each conversation is not always to book a meeting. Might be to get some information to then help future you book a meeting.
Got it. Awesome. So shifting gears a little here, this is always the part I love. So since you guys have so much experience, can we talk about some like great successes or like epic fails in the past when you guys were setting these up? Will, I believe you said that you had a step close to the end where you would tell people, I'm going to call you tomorrow. How did that go?
Oh, yeah. So that was a risky step. And I don't know. I don't think any of the sequences that I've set at Lavender actually have that step in anymore. Also because our SDRs are less dependent on phone than I was previously. Kind of selling Lavender, you kind of have to be good at email. So it's a big focus of ours. But one, to Allie's point earlier, sometimes you can use the steps to kind of lead to the next one. So as I said, my first step is generally a cold call, leave a voicemail. Hey, I'm sending you an email. And then the email says, hey, I just left your voicemail. Don't call me back. Here's why I'm reaching out to you, right? So when you can combine them, they become almost more powerful. It's kind of like, use a boxing analogy. Hate sports analogies in sports, so I don't know what in sales, so I don't know why I use it, but I like to think of it like a 1-2 punch, you know what I mean? And that's going to be more effective than just throwing little jabs every now and again. So one I used to run was I would send them an email one day prior saying, hey, Scott, gonna buzz you tomorrow at 11 a.m. A lot of sales leaders are finding this, thought this might be helpful. And then I'll drop a resource and said, look forward to asking you questions about this tomorrow. Speak then. And then send that email off. And so I'd be telling them, hey, I'm going to give you a call tomorrow at 11 a.m. Then I'd have my time blocked because I knew that time was going to come up the next day. And I would definitely call them at that time, regardless if they replied or not. Well, if they did reply, then I would, if they said yes. But if no, then, wow, I've just saved it. Now, some people get a little bit upset about that because it's kind of like, I'm going to call you. It's very assumptive. It's kind of like saying, hey, no matter what happens, I'm going to call you. But in my mind, if I was going to make the call at 11 a.m. tomorrow anyway, then what's the harm in telling them? But you'd see if you tested that you get a lot of responses to that step, but a lot more negative ones than usual. But in my mind, that was still good because I was kind of getting them out of the sequence anyway. And it told me that probably if I had called them, then they may have been irate anyway. So I found that was a really high response rate in my sequences. And I'd normally wait a little bit later on in the sequence. It'd normally be like, step 16 or something like that towards the end. It'd be like maybe 1 or 2 steps before my breakup email. But I used to find that would actually get a lot of responses, both positive and negative. So it was a risky one, but it worked if getting an answer is your goal. So that's more of a story rather than a massive success, but it's one to try out and test out if you are testing, just to see how your market responds to it. I was selling to sales leaders, and based on their reaction, I think other markets may even be more adverse to getting told, I'm going to call you at this time. But yeah, that's a little one for you.
Interesting. Awesome. Allie, how about you? Any successes that you found?
Yeah, I think be creative. And the cool thing about selling and the cool thing about like this, just selling in general is everyone has a different way that they can drive success. And so like, don't hesitate to put your personality and your own spin on things, especially those manual, like customized emails. So for example, one of the things we had success with in the past was, sending a picture, maybe you are a dog person, a cat person, a bird person, right? Like send a picture of your animal and say like, hey, me and my dog's name is Maya. Me and Maya are patiently waiting for a response. Like, let me know if I missed the mark here. So getting creative that way, and especially as you're doing due diligence and research on your prospects, if something stands out in their profile, mentioning those pieces too. And going beyond just mentioning it, but maybe sending a video or sending a picture, that kind of tailors to that research you've done. For example, at one point in my career, I was prospecting into Topgolf. And so I went to Topgolf with some friends and just had them like take a video of me doing a really bad golf swing, and included just a little like quick snippet video of like, hey, in the meantime, I'm practicing my golf swing, like, water under the bridge if it doesn't make sense, like I'm enjoying Topgolf anyways. So little pieces like that can kind of help you stand out and cut through the noise, and just make it fun, right? There's so many different ways that we can put our personalities into sales, and that's what I think really shines through as you're working with customers and prospects as well.
Awesome. Great. Thanks. So we're almost at time here. If there's any questions from the audience, feel free to submit them. But any other thoughts, anything we didn't touch on that you guys want to share with the audience?
No, I like Allie's point there. Videos are a really cool thing to include in sequences. Again, just ways to show that you're human and you're a person with ideally a smile on your face as well. And sequences often don't have to be as boring as they seem. Like I had loads of fun like adding memes into my sequences at one point as well. They were like, I'll give one, for example, like I'd get like a classic meme template, like the Drake one where he's like that, and then he's like that and that one. So then I'd like, if I was doing Orum, for example, I might like put like making every call individually. And then the second one is like, making 5 calls at once and having 50% more conversations on average. Don't know if those are the right stats. Like that could be a cool meme just to drop in there and just, again, just disrupt like the flow of what they're probably expecting and used to from a sales sequence. But yeah, that's probably all I got. I've got a template which I'm happy to share with you. If anyone watching this now or after the fact wants to hit me up on LinkedIn, I can share my sequence template with y'all as well. It's done me pretty well over my days.
Awesome. And one final question for you, Allie. Like as a sales leader, what like part of this do your reps like resist the most or like have the most trouble getting enthusiastic about? And then how would you encourage them for any other managers on the call?
That's a really good question. I think it's all about going back to the why on things. And I have found in the past, some resistance on team-based sequences. People don't like being restricted, and I totally get it. Like again, it kind of contradicts, right? Like put your personality into it, but hey, use this sequence. So I've seen resistance there in the past. So I think it just goes back to describing the why, and then also like empowering and giving autonomy as you've kind of proven yourself, right? So I'd say, for me, managing AEs, like if you want to clone your own sequences and get creative, you have a proven record, like go for it, test those out, but share them, right? And collaborate with the team so that we're not all just operating in silos. So giving opportunities for that collaboration and to like empower people, I think is really important, but also, showing, especially for newer SDRs, like, hey, this is why I'm asking you to use this sequence. Here's an example of one that we went rogue on, and this was the response rate, or this was what we booked from it, versus this one we've had thousands of hundreds of thousands or whatever of prospects go through it, and look at how it's performing. Let's just start with this one if there's ways or areas that you don't like in it, or ideas you have to make it better, share. Like, we want to hear all of that stuff, and let's collaborate together to put together maybe an A/B test. So still giving that voice and empowering, but sharing the why of like, this is what's in it, for them, and how it's been performing in the past, I think is important. But yeah, I would say those are the two things, is kind of understanding and explaining the benefit, and then where you see opportunity to improve, empowering and allowing people to share that and actually make that change too. But let's make it for the team so we can all benefit versus operating in silos.
Awesome. Yeah, great. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your expertise and your great stories. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Allie. And then thank you, everybody, for joining us, whether you're live here or you're watching the recording. We do hope that you'll join us next month. We do these every month.